I'll never go back in the subway again from Fibion. It was approaching midnight, though I couldn't be certain. My perception of time had been distorted by exhaustion and anxiety that night. I had worked an extra hour at the diner, then stopped at the 24-hour grocery for essentials, diapers, baby formula, and breakfast items. My 6-month-old daughter dozed peacefully in her sling across my chest. It was late, later than I'd promised the new babysitter, watching my toddler son at home. The sitter was a kind college student, expecting me by 11:15 at the latest, but my best estimate placed the time around 11:30, possibly even a quarter to midnight. My husband wouldn't return until dawn. He worked third shift at a packaging plant. I didn't want to leave the inexperienced sitter alone with my son any longer than necessary. So there I sat, a solitary mother, with a sleeping infant, in a nearly vacant subway car, heading homeward. The overhead lights occasionally emitted an unsettling buzz. My carefully balanced grocery bag rested on the adjacent seat. Only a handful of other passengers occupied the car. A man absently flipping through a magazine. A woman in a hooded sweatshirt, and perhaps one or two others, their faces blurred in my memory. All of us bore the unmistakable marks of fatigue. As we rattled through the tunnels, I calculated the remaining journey. 2 more stops. If the schedule held, I'd be home in 15 minutes. I adjusted my daughter's sling, drawing comfort from her gentle warmth. She stirred slightly but remained asleep. The train lurched around a bend, and my thoughts returned to the babysitter. What if my toddler was being difficult? What if he was causing problems? My imagination conjured a series of increasingly troubling scenarios. She was probably watching the clock, wondering about my whereabouts. That's when it happened. The lights in the subway car flickered once, twice, then plunged us into absolute darkness. The subway often experienced momentary electrical glitches, but this blackout persisted unnaturally long. In that sudden void, my senses heightened painfully. I heard my baby's soft rhythmic breathing, the distant hum of wheels on rails, and what I perceived as a faint scraping sound near the rear of the car. A strange, primal dread bloomed in my core. I turned instinctively, straining to see through the darkness, and that's when I perceived it. There was a figure in the far corner, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, as if its body had been elongated beyond human proportions. Its face was smooth and featureless. I discerned no eyes, no nose, and its head bent sharply forward, as though the ceiling were insufficient for its height. Its shoulders appeared unnaturally narrow, its arms grotesquely long, terminating somewhere near its knees. I felt its gaze upon me. The sensation was visceral, like ice-cold fingers trailing down my spine. I gasped involuntarily, recoiling, and at that precise moment, the lights flickered back to life. The subway car appeared exactly as before. The other passengers remained in their places, showing no signs of alarm. The corner where I'd glimpsed the entity now contained only an empty metal pole and vacant seats. When I glanced around, the other passengers regarded me with curious or confused expressions. My reaction must have been audible. Embarrassed and unnerved, I forced a weak smile and settled back into my seat. Just stress and exhaustion, I assured myself. A trick of shadows, a hallucination born of an overworked mind. But the unnatural sensation lingered. My skin prickled at the memory. I tried to redirect my thoughts. The groceries, my baby's reassuring weight, the passing stations. Soon I would be home. Soon I would rejoin my son, and relieve the babysitter with apologies for my tardiness. But then, the lights extinguished again. Without warning, that suffocating dread returned instantly. The car continued its journey, and in that impenetrable darkness, my pulse accelerated. I could see nothing, not even my own hands, but I sensed movement, a presence, deliberate yet fluid, crossing the aisle. Something was approaching, and I knew with sickening certainty what it was. My baby whimpered, as if disturbed by the entity's proximity. I placed a protective hand over her back, drawing her close. There was a momentary flicker, light struggling to reassert itself, but it only served to reveal what was advancing toward me. It was that elongated silhouette, now terrifyingly closer than before. It loomed directly before me, towering over my seat. In that fractional glimpse, I saw its featureless face mere inches from my own. I detected a faint rustling, like dry parchment, and smelled something ancient and cold. The lights failed completely once more, and I screamed involuntarily, a primal terror-stricken cry. Then, as if my scream had broken some dark enchantment, the lights snapped back with unwavering intensity. The entity had vanished without a trace, not even a shadow remaining. The other passengers had bolted upright, startled by my outburst. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, I heard someone mutter, "This woman's losing it." Without further comment, they migrated to a different car. Within moments, I was alone, save for my baby. The door hissed shut as the others departed. Through the small window, I watched them settle into seats in the adjacent car, distancing themselves from my apparent instability. I swallowed with difficulty. The car was silent, except for the metallic squeal of wheels. I attempted to convince myself again that I was experiencing hallucinations, that my sleep-deprived, stress-laden mind was manufacturing phantoms. Twice now, I'd witnessed something that disappeared the instant light returned. Such phenomena defied physical laws, therefore they couldn't be real. Nevertheless, I clutched my daughter tighter, whispering gentle reassurances to calm both her and myself. I avoided looking down the aisle. The train would reach my station momentarily. I only needed to endure a few more minutes. I counted each breath, fixing my gaze on the flickering neon advertisements outside the window. Anything to anchor myself in reality. So far so good. No more flickering lights. No more apparitions. I began to think perhaps I'd frightened myself over nothing. Just as we prepared to decelerate into my station, perhaps a minute away at most, I felt a pressure on my left shoulder. Not a violent grasp, but a gentle, steady weight, as if someone tall were leaning down and lightly draping an arm around me. The skin on my neck crawled. My baby stirred and began to fuss. I froze, paralyzed by terror. The arm felt cold and smooth, unlike normal human flesh. It reminded me of polished material, yet it was substantial enough that I clearly felt it compressing my jacket. I stared fixedly ahead, tears gathering at the corners of my eyes, heart thundering so violently. I felt certain it would be audible to anyone nearby, if I weren't completely alone. I remained like that for perhaps half a minute, though it stretched into an eternity. In my peripheral vision, I saw nothing. The reflection in the window opposite showed only me and empty seats. Yet the weight on my shoulder was undeniably real and persistent. Finally, the train began to slow. The wheels screeched against the track, and the familiar automated voice announced my station. The doors slid open with their characteristic hiss. In that instant, the pressure vanished, as if the entity had withdrawn, disappointed. My baby released a soft wail, sensing my distress. Without daring to look around, I rose unsteadily, clutching the groceries in one hand, and pressing my daughter protectively against my chest with the other. I stepped onto the platform, nearly collapsing as my trembling legs threatened to give way. The doors closed behind me, and the train accelerated into the darkness, hopefully taking whatever presence had tormented me along with it. Once outside the station, beneath the reassuring glow of streetlights, I inhaled deeply. My entire body quivered. The world seemed unnaturally quiet. I heard my daughter's occasional sniffle before she settled, and I hurried home as rapidly as possible. When I reached the apartment, the babysitter was in the living room, visibly relieved. My toddler was asleep. I paid her, included a generous tip, thanked her profusely, and apologized for my lateness. After she departed, I secured every door and window, then sat in the kitchen for 30 minutes, shaking uncontrollably, my face buried in my hands. The following morning, when my husband returned from his shift, I told him we needed a vehicle, any functional car that would allow me to avoid the subway permanently. I provided minimal details. He must have recognized the genuine fear in my expression, because he didn't question my urgency. We agreed to begin saving immediately, and mercifully, I never had to enter the subway again. I cannot explain my experience.
Perhaps it was indeed nerves and exhaustion. Perhaps it was a trick of faulty lighting and an overstimulated imagination. But I know what I felt and what I saw, and I know I never wish to encounter it again.
The Living Graffiti. From Prevails. In the early 1990s, I secured a maintenance position in an aging subway system beneath a major East Coast city. I won't specify the location, for reasons that will become apparent. I was young then, accepting whatever employment I could find, and underground work paid surprisingly well. The hours were challenging to adjust to, and the tunnels perpetually smelled of damp concrete and stagnant air. But one adapts. The system had been constructed decades earlier, with extensions and renovations accumulated over time. This created a labyrinthine network of side passages, abandoned spurs, and sealed access corridors. My team's responsibilities included structural integrity inspections, leak repairs, and occasionally removing graffiti, which proliferated everywhere underground. Some was fresh and vibrant. Other markings had faded to barely discernible remnants. We typically ignored it, unless supervisors specifically requested repainting certain sections. I first heard the unusual rumors after my second week. Two colleagues, I'll call them Larry and Starla, mentioned shifting tags near an abandoned platform. They discussed it with uneasy humor, as if uncertain how seriously to consider their own observations. You cover up a piece one night, and next time you're there, it's rearranged, Larry explained. Starla shrugged, non-committally, suggesting she found the concept absurd. I assumed it was mischief by teenagers who had discovered covert access points. The city had no shortage of individuals willing to venture underground for various thrills. But as time passed, I encountered increasingly bizarre accounts. A younger worker claimed he'd once misplaced a tool pouch near a suspicious patch of paint, only to find it the following shift, shredded, as if by some unknown force, with no identifiable marks, but irregular tears, and an unidentifiable moist residue. He hadn't reported it, understandably. I mentally catalogued these stories, but remained skeptical. The tunnels harbored rats, occasional stray cats, perhaps even disoriented dogs. These could explain damaged items. Nevertheless, certain details troubled me, especially when I began noticing anomalous graffiti. Periodically, I'd encounter large murals or tag clusters in obscure recesses. The paint would appear fresh one night, then strangely altered, or reconfigured the next, without any paint odor or drips that would accompany human activity. My first personal encounter occurred in a side passage near an unused maintenance hatch. I'd gone to investigate a persistent water seepage. The corridor was dimly lit, illuminated only by my flashlight. The walls bore layers of accumulated paint. Some tags dated back decades and were flaking away, while others appeared recent, with crisp lines and peculiar organic designs. As I swept my light across one such section, I perceived movement, a subtle ripple, as if the paint were momentarily swelling outward before settling flat. I leaned closer, thinking perhaps moisture had infiltrated beneath a loose paint layer. When I tapped lightly with my flashlight handle, it met solid concrete. I dismissed the observation as fatigue-induced, but an uncomfortable sensation persisted along my spine for hours afterward. I decided to consult a veteran employee, someone with extensive experience. This led me to Carl, who had worked in the tunnels since the late 1970s and had encountered numerous unusual phenomena. He regarded me intently when I mentioned the shifting paint rumors. After a moment's hesitation, he suggested I speak with Miller instead, who he cryptically added had a story and a scar to match. I located Miller during a coffee break in the underground rest area. He was older, with graying temples and a reserved demeanor. He listened attentively to my tentative inquiries, then rolled up his sleeve. On his inner wrist was a pale, thin scar, not resembling any bite mark I'd ever seen, but more like a burn in a strange, sinuous pattern, similar to a leech's trail. He tapped it with his fingertip. "Got this about a decade ago," he stated quietly, when I tried to investigate what was behind a suspicious paint patch. He called them scroll leeches. He explained he had approached a section of wall that resembled ordinary graffiti, but had a slight central bulge. Assuming it might be a hollow area, or perhaps a prank, he touched it, and part of the paint layer peeled back like a wet curtain. Something beneath lashed out, some membrane or tendril that seared his skin before he could withdraw his arm. He never obtained a clear view of the entire entity, only that it retreated into a fissure when he shouted and directed his flashlight fully upon it. "These things mimic paint," Miller explained grimly. "They blend with the layered patterns. From what I've gathered, they move silently at night, altering their configurations to attract small animals, cats, rats, even small dogs that wander in. They're predators, hiding in plain sight." I wanted to dismiss his account as preposterous, but I recalled my own disturbing observation, the shredded tool pouch story, and various other rumors. The subway's oldest sections were rarely visited. Perhaps if unusual organisms had evolved or migrated there, who would notice? Another worker, Justine, joined our conversation. She described finding strange oily streaks on the floor, tracks of colored residue leading nowhere. Initially mistaking them for spilled paint, she later discovered a partially consumed rodent nearby. The remains appeared to have been pressed against the wall until the fluids were extracted. Justine never walked alone in the tunnels thereafter. Over subsequent weeks, I grew increasingly cautious. Our supervisors never acknowledged these entities, preferring to attribute unusual findings to conventional animals or vandalism. But workers whispered among themselves. Miller theorized that in the deepest, permanently abandoned tunnels, areas scheduled for no future use, entire colonies of these scroll leeches might exist, clinging to the walls like living murals, waiting in silence. He had never ventured that far himself, but knew someone who had encountered multiple entities simultaneously and fled before being detected. My second direct encounter occurred after I accidentally dropped my flashlight's spare battery near a suspiciously vibrant wall section. It was late in my shift, and I was alone in a dead-end passage, investigating reported seepage. I bent to retrieve the battery, and glanced up to see the paint patterns above me beginning to glisten. The most precise description I can provide. The design that I had mistaken for stylized letters shimmered, then subtly moved. I glimpsed what resembled a segmented appendage withdrawing into the paint layer. There was a soft, wet sound, almost inaudible. I didn't linger to investigate further. I retreated slowly, never turning my back, until I reached a well-illuminated junction. Only then did I run, suddenly acutely aware of the unsettling nature of my workplace. In subsequent days, I spoke with additional colleagues. One had observed fluid dripping from a painted eye, a droplet that struck the ground and disappeared. Another claimed the entity's patterns changed strategically, not randomly, creating camouflage for ambushing prey. None of us possessed concrete evidence. We never captured photographs or collected samples, partially from fear. What if a camera flash provoked these creatures? What if approaching too closely earned a scar like Miller's, or worse? Acknowledging these entities' existence would also mean confronting something we couldn't readily explain to management or authorities. I began carrying a heavier flashlight and a small pry bar as precautions. If something attacked, I wanted some defensive capability. But the more I considered it, the more futile it seemed. These creatures possessed every advantage: perfect camouflage, within decades of accumulated paint, selection of isolated locations, and intimate knowledge of their territory. One evening near the end of my tenure there, I rounded a corner and discovered evidence of a recent incident. I found remains pressed against a painted motif, resembling a distorted face. The tissue bore puncture marks, not tooth-like impressions, but pressure points where paint had solidified into something sharp. I backed away, nauseated. My flashlight beam caught peripheral movement, just enough to confirm one of the shapes reverting to a flat pattern when illuminated. That incident finalized my decision. Though I felt reasonably confident these entities posed minimal threat to humans, the company's refusal to officially acknowledge the situation troubled me. The unwritten protocol was clear: maintain silence, perform your duties, and depart. The ancient tunnels now belonged to these creatures, and we lacked any strategy to eliminate them. Why risk injury in an environment harboring concealed predators, whose existence no one would officially confirm? Within a month, I requested a transfer, citing personal reasons. Eventually, I secured railway employment several states away, above ground. The compensation was lower, but the fresh air and open spaces compensated adequately. There were no cryptid entities to worry about. I never shared this experience with new colleagues. Who would believe it? The early 1990s predated ubiquitous documentation technology, and even had I captured an image, what would it prove? These creatures, when photographed, would appear indistinguishable from ordinary graffiti. Accept or reject this account as you will. It may not be the most terrifying tale, but its strangeness persists in my memory. Have you heard of the Chisel Man? From Graded Dead 3, I recall when I first began taking those late-night trains on that aging subway line. It was early spring 1993. The transit authority had mostly phased it out, leaving just a few midnight runs for nocturnal commuters like myself. I was juggling 2 part-time positions and evening classes, so the late hours represented my only option. Those trains were unnervingly quiet and poorly illuminated, rattling through tunnels that seemed increasingly fragile with each journey. The schedules were erratic, and the stations were frequently deserted. I rarely encountered more than a handful of fellow passengers, sometimes none at all. My employment offered minimal compensation, but I couldn't afford personal transportation. So this became my routine, a phantom journey through the city's subterranean arteries aboard a metal serpent traversing ancient steel pathways. The after-hours subway always emanated an inherent eeriness. Perhaps everyone perceives this. Or perhaps it was my unique sensitivity to being underground at such hours. Surrounded by so few people, the environment simply felt more unsettling than during daylight operations. The flickering fluorescent lights and the train's occasional shuddering intensified this sensation. The conductors maintained minimal communication. The scattered transit workers I glimpsed through grimy windows invariably appeared exhausted. Most nights featured more maintenance crews than passengers. That's how I initially learned about the Chisel Man. One late evening, riding aboard a nearly vacant train, I noticed a crumpled pamphlet abandoned on a seat. An outdated guide to track closures, with faded text warning of unforeseen conditions in older tunnels. I turned it over idly. Someone had scrawled in blue ink, "Chisel Man, still down here." The cryptic note meant nothing to me. I replaced the pamphlet and focused on remaining awake. Over subsequent weeks I repeatedly encountered that name. I spotted it on a yellowed newspaper left on a bench, and once written in graffiti on a station column, visible only as the train decelerated. Always ambiguous, never an explicit warning, but presented like a whispered rumor. I began to suspect it represented some urban inside joke I wasn't privy to. Perhaps akin to the Kilroy was here phenomenon from World War II. A simple caricature soldiers would sketch in unexpected locations, creating an early form of viral content. I assigned little significance to these Chisel Man references. I finally received clarification one night while awaiting my delayed train. I noticed another passenger, a man approximately my age wearing a heavy coat and carrying a worn leather satchel. He surveyed the platform, appearing as fatigued and irritated as I felt. When my train eventually arrived, we both boarded. We seemed to be the sole passengers. We occupied the same car, and I recalled having seen him occasionally before. I decided to initiate conversation. We exchanged pleasantries, inquiring about each other's evening, occupations, and recent work experiences. During the first awkward conversational lull, I mentioned the peculiar Chisel Man references I'd been noticing. His reaction confirmed his familiarity with the topic. Here's what he shared. To the best of my recollection, during the 1950s, there was a particularly brutal serial perpetrator. If the historical accounts are accurate, he employed a chisel as his instrument, targeted night travelers, and left no discernible pattern beyond his methodology. He vanished following a pursuit through city streets. One summer evening, authorities suspected he might have descended underground, literally. Some claim they searched these tunnels for weeks without results. Officially, he escaped without trace, or perhaps perished down here. But unofficially, rumors persist that he never departed these tunnels. I asked, with genuine curiosity, if he was suggesting that the perpetrator's spirit was believed to haunt the subway. He crossed his arms and nodded affirmatively. He believed it represented a legend that had been exaggerated, or at most, a copycat seeking attention. During subsequent days, I continued searching for additional evidence. I had transformed this urban myth of the Chisel Man into a diversion whenever I found myself bored during train journeys or station waits. One evening, I awkwardly attempted to build confidence to approach a station attendant, one of the more experienced-looking employees, to determine if he possessed relevant information. I eventually approached one, whose nameplate identified him as Mally, and vaguely inquired whether any urban legends existed regarding historical incidents in the subway. He regarded me suspiciously. "Why are you asking about that? Don't come down here spreading more stories." He then departed, visibly annoyed. That reaction alone confirmed he had heard something, but preferred not to discuss it. Later, I overheard something that lent additional credibility. Two college students, waiting for their scheduled train, discussed a friend who had allegedly observed an unsettling individual holding something metallic near an abandoned platform. Though they never mentioned Chisel Man specifically, the connection seemed obvious. Months passed, and eventually my interest waned. I ceased contemplating and inquiring about the matter entirely. One night, the train I occupied decelerated near the old City Hall extension, an area long closed to public access. Illumination was dimmer there, maintenance staff presumably neglecting to replace bulbs with standard frequency. I peered through the window more intently, not due to any lingering thoughts about the Chisel Man, which as mentioned had faded from my consciousness, but simply curious about this abandoned section. That's when I glimpsed movement, a face ducking behind a support column, pale, with hollow eyes, visible for only an instant. More disturbing, I clearly saw something in his hand, something metallic that he had been dragging along the floor, where fresh scratch marks were evident, as if a tool had been drawn across concrete. Immediately, Chisel Man flashed in my thoughts. The encounter disturbed me for the entire subsequent week, which brings me to the conclusion of this account. It wasn't particularly frightening, merely unsettling. The possibility that an unidentified perpetrator might still lurk in those tunnels, and that I might have glimpsed him. Realistically, it was probably just an unhoused individual passing time in his own fashion. Demon or deranged creature? From 34th Emerald, I should never have been on that train at such a late hour. But after relocating to my parents' home, I no longer enjoyed a convenient commute. Before my recent separation from my boyfriend, I could walk home in 20 minutes. Now I lived across the city, back in my childhood bedroom with its faded posters. My parents were well-intentioned, but overprotective, and this extended subway journey had become my new routine. That evening I'd remained late at the office, attempting to impress my supervisor, and consequently found myself on the final train heading from Manhattan to the quiet residential district where my parents resided. By the time I boarded the nearly empty subway car, midnight approached. The train proceeded with occasional light fluctuations. Only a handful of other passengers shared the space. A young man dozing with headphones, a couple engaged in hushed conversation possibly disagreeing, which resonated with my recent experiences, and an elderly man, humming tunelessly near the distant door. I attempted to avoid excessive observation of my fellow travelers. Instead, I gazed at my reflection in the window, noting my exhausted appearance. But it was a weariness that rest couldn't remedy. My former relationship had endured 3 years before dissolution. Now everything had vanished, and I found myself on late-night trains like some displaced traveler in an unfamiliar city, despite it being my hometown. The transfer station was one of those ancient underground facilities, with tiled walls that had remained uncleaned for decades. When I disembarked, I anticipated a silent, vacant platform. But immediately after the train began to depart, leaving me alone, I detected an unusual scuffling noise echoing through the corridor. The sound seemed distinctly out of place in a subway environment, causing me to pause momentarily. As the train receded, its lights reflected on the damp floor. The scent of industrial disinfectant and aged lubricant permeated the air. When the train completely disappeared, I attempted to disregard the persistent scuffling sounds. I assumed it originated from machinery concealed behind walls, or perhaps maintenance personnel conducting their duties behind closed doors. I clutched my purse more firmly and proceeded toward the stairs leading to the surface. After several steps, I noticed a shape near the platform's far end. Uneasiness crept through me. Something large crouched there, low to the ground. It resembled a substantial canine. Stray dogs occasionally ventured underground. But for what purpose? As I cautiously approached, curiosity transformed into horror. Beneath flickering fluorescent lights, I discerned the form of a large creature resembling a pit bull, but unnaturally oversized. It had dark, soiled fur and was hunched over something, tearing at it ferociously. I covered my mouth to suppress both a scream and rising nausea when I realized what it was consuming. A human form, motionless, being devoured by this beast that appeared similar to a pit bull, but significantly larger than any I'd encountered. I glimpsed a limp arm, a shoe. I observed the creature ripping into tissue with wet, tearing sounds. Though I muffled my scream, I emitted a quiet gasp. My heart seemed to stop when the animal's head snapped up, ears alert, eyes fixing on me. That moment of paralysis seemed eternal. Neither I nor the creature moved. After several excruciating seconds, I heard a low, rumbling growl. It released whatever it held, which fell to the ground with a sickening sound. Its entire posture transformed as muscles tensed, and it rose from its crouched position. It began advancing toward me. Terror surged through my body, and instinctively, I pivoted and fled desperately, ignoring the pain in my side and my thundering heartbeat. I could hear its paws echoing through the empty corridor as I raced down a side passage, deeper into the station's labyrinth. I didn't even consider screaming. I had no concept of my destination. I remember panting frantically, the clicking of claws behind me raising goosebumps across my skin. Then clarity emerged. If I was disoriented and pursued by something faster than myself, I needed concealment. Around a corner, I fortuitously spotted a restroom sign. I darted inside, a single-occupancy facility, with a substantial door and functional lock. I secured it and collapsed to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. Within seconds, revealing how narrowly I'd escaped, scratching and clawing assaulted the door, accompanied by sniffing sounds. That's when my screams finally erupted. I released everything, all accumulated fear and terror. Shortly afterward, the scratching and clawing ceased, and I heard claws retreating. The entity had departed. I crawled silently across the unsanitary bathroom floor and pressed my ear against the door. I detected nothing. Unlike typical horror narratives, I didn't emerge at the first indication of silence. Instead, I remained in that secure though repulsive bathroom for approximately 5 additional minutes. Eventually, it wasn't even my decision to leave. A custodian unlocked the door. I hadn't realized they possessed such capability, though it seemed logical in retrospect. He discovered me huddled on the floor, tears streaming. He inquired about my welfare, and mentioned hearing screams. I rushed toward him, and peered past him into the corridor, confirming nothing lurked there. Only the two of us remained. There was a creature, I explained frantically. It chased me. It was consuming someone. My explanation surely sounded deranged. The custodian appeared simultaneously confused and frightened. I grasped the elderly man's hand, and led him determinedly, intent on showing him precisely where I'd encountered the beast and its victim. Within a minute, we returned to the location, but no evidence remained. No trace of the creature, no indication of the body, not even a blood droplet on the floor. It was
I swear it was right here, I insisted, attempting to sound rational, but likely achieving the opposite effect. I stood completely bewildered. I knew with absolute certainty what I had witnessed and what had pursued me, yet now no evidence existed to corroborate my experience. I apologized hastily and fled the subway. To this day I remain convinced I encountered that creature, though whether it represented a physical animal, a spiritual manifestation, or something beyond conventional categorization, I cannot determine. However, one certainty remains: that unfortunate custodian likely considers me delusional.
Which of the tunnels? From Anonymous. Approximately 20 years ago, I joined a subway systems maintenance division as a junior technician. Our responsibilities included ensuring structural integrity and reporting concerns to supervisors. We operated during unconventional hours to minimize train interference, typically after midnight when service was reduced, and we could safely traverse the tracks. During my initial shift, I met Everett, a thin, aging man with remarkably steady hands and a cautious demeanor. He welcomed me neither warmly nor coldly, but matter-of-factly. His manner suggested he had witnessed numerous colleagues come and go. He identified specific problematic areas, sections where ceiling material occasionally crumbled. However, he never mentioned anything unusual or paranormal. Those accounts emerged later through whispered conversations among crew members. As the newest employee, I became the target of these tales, intended to unsettle me. I was warned I might observe peripheral movement flashes or hear indistinct whispers. I dismissed these stories initially. My priorities involved learning routes, avoiding rail hazards, and preventing structural elements from striking me. After several weeks, I noticed that Track 7 represented a peculiar location. Crew members consistently lowered their voices when discussing it. One colleague sighed heavily whenever assigned to that line. Another stated he would prefer crawling through flooded conduits to approaching Track 7's maintenance corridor alone. Neither provided a clear explanation for their apprehension, which made me increasingly uneasy. I inquired further. A worker nicknamed Final, whose nickname's origin remained mysterious despite my tenure there, finally offered information when I directly questioned him about Track 7. He laughed, acknowledging I would inevitably discover the situation, and expressed preference for my learning about it, rather than experiencing it firsthand. Apparently, reports existed of an entity inhabiting that area, a hooded elderly female figure, hunched and silent. Allegedly, she materialized beneath a specific section of Track 7's overhead beams, simply standing motionless. Catching her in your light supposedly brought consequences. Final's expression became serious. They call her the Crone under 7, he explained. Some believe she's a spirit, or something worse. Stories predated his employment there. Those claiming to have encountered her reported subsequent illness and detecting the scent of decomposing vegetation. That evening I dismissed these accounts, more attempts to unnerve the newcomer, or perhaps workplace folklore. Every occupational environment harbors such tales, but as additional shifts passed, I heard increasingly consistent details. A hooded figure always silent, perpetually beyond direct view, disappearing too rapidly for confirmation. Some reported equipment malfunctions, fully charged flashlights failing unexpectedly. Others described discovering inexplicable piles of rotted foliage, which seemed incongruous in a subterranean environment. My first personal experience near Track 7 occurred during a quiet Tuesday morning, around 2 a.m. I was temporarily alone, after my partner hurried to repair a fuse box 2 sections away. I needed to inspect a joint where the track bed sagged slightly. The corridor felt heavier than usual, the air damp and unnaturally cool. As I illuminated the area, I noticed something dark and misplaced in my peripheral vision. I turned cautiously, trying not to startle myself. Just beyond my light's reach stood a shape. It remained motionless, low to the ground. I couldn't discern details, but it had human proportions, enshrouded in darkness. I recalled Final's warning, don't shine your light directly at her. I angled my flashlight slightly, catching only the shape's edge. For an instant, I glimpsed what appeared to be a thin, gnarled hand gripping metal. Then a scent reached me, faint but unmistakable, like decaying foliage. I retreated instinctively, and when I looked up again, the figure had vanished. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my equipment. The following day, still disturbed by the incident, I approached the colleague who consistently sighed when assigned Track 7, asking if she believed in the Crone. She glanced nervously around before nodding. I encountered her once, years ago, she confided. Didn't approach too closely, but it was sufficient. I lost a quality pair of pliers that night, and discovered them days later, inexplicably rusted and twisted, near that location. I have no explanation for how they were transported there, or their condition. I now complete my duties in that corridor, as expeditiously as possible. Then there was Rivas, a younger worker, who had been employed only slightly longer than myself. He claimed no personal sightings of the Crone, but knew someone who had. This individual, overcome by curiosity, had approached the figure, attempting to provoke a reaction. The very next shift, he resigned without notice. Before departing, he allegedly confided in Rivas that he had ventured close enough to glimpse her face beneath the hood. He described sunken cheeks and hollow eye sockets. The proximity had induced weakness and nausea, accompanied by an overwhelming scent of earth and decay. During a subsequent late shift, I discovered unusual scratch marks on a steel beam near Track 7. They appeared too deliberate, minuscule lines arranged in patterns. I crouched to examine them, and noticed scattered brownish fragments, resembling dried leaves or petals, though their presence underground defied explanation. The concept that some supernatural entity might leave physical remnants profoundly unsettled me. As evident from this account, my skepticism gradually yielded to acceptance of the Crone's reality. The longer I worked there, the accumulated debris raised additional questions. Was this entity transporting material from the surface? If so, what purpose did it serve? Was it creating some form of nest, or was this simply evidence of an unhoused individual living in the tunnels? Time passed and reported sightings became increasingly infrequent. I learned to keep both my flashlight beam and gaze averted from anything resembling a human silhouette. Eventually, I witnessed the Crone legends fade completely. The subject was no longer discussed, no one reported encounters. I can only speculate that perhaps her essence or spirit finally transcended whatever she represented. To this day, I wonder about the Crone's true nature. Exploring the tunnel from friends of friends? I swear this happened even now. 16 years later, my hands tremble attempting to document this experience. I was among those adolescents featured in late-night cable documentaries, individuals who seek abandoned structures and traverse spaces untouched for decades. In autumn 2008, I was completing my final year of high school in a small Massachusetts community. I craved something more stimulating than football games and formulaic horror films. My closest friends, Adrian and Randy, shared this adventurous inclination. We identified ourselves as urban explorers, though we rarely disclosed our activities. We sought to uncover secrets concealed beneath everyday existence. We began modestly, an obsolete paper mill on the town's periphery, an abandoned drive-in theater with corroded speaker stands and overgrown grounds, even the administrative facility of a decommissioned psychiatric hospital. Typically, we found weathered documents, personal effects, vintage calendars still affixed to mildewed walls, silent reminders of bygone eras. All these excursions seemed insignificant compared to what awaited us beneath the surface that October weekend. I continue experiencing occasional nightmares about those tunnels. I'm not requesting belief, merely relating what I witnessed, heard, and what nearly terminated my existence and those of my closest companions. Adrian discovered information about abandoned subway tunnels through an obscure online forum while researching historical transit projects. Apparently during the 1950s, Our town had planned a subway line within a statewide expansion initiative. Construction had commenced earnestly. Segments of tunnel excavated through bedrock concrete platforms partially established, before abrupt termination. Official explanations cited financial constraints and worker accidents. Unofficially, rumors circulated about something else repeatedly impeding progress. The line was never completed or integrated into the primary system. Eventually, public memory faded, but not entirely. We found cryptic references online. Retired municipal engineers claimed these tunnels persisted, sealed behind maintenance shafts, and secured hatches. Adrian grew determined to access them. Randy and I encouraged his pursuit. We informed our parents we would be camping that weekend, but instead prepared equipment suitable for subterranean exploration. On a chilly Saturday afternoon, we located what appeared to be an entrance, a shaft behind an aging electrical substation. After considerable effort with a crowbar, we managed to open a corroded steel door. Within, metal rungs descended into darkness. I exchanged glances with Adrian and Randy before our descent. Adrian exhibited a nervous smile. Randy offered a nod conveying both excitement and apprehension. We proceeded in silence. The initial sensation upon reaching the bottom was olfactory, a damp, heavy, strangely organic smell, resembling a saturated forest floor, but with sharper, muskier undertones. This seemed unusual. Other underground locations typically smelled of stagnant air, dust, and mold. This was distinctly different, almost animalistic. We activated our lights and discovered a surprisingly intact tunnel section, featuring concrete walls, antiquated wiring overhead, and rusted rails that terminated abruptly behind us. The area had been sealed for decades, yet appeared remarkably preserved. We proceeded for approximately 20 minutes, conversing quietly. The silence felt overwhelming, our footsteps echoing into the darkness ahead. Then we observed something disturbing. Deep gouges in the concrete walls resembling claw marks. Randy traced these indentations with gloved fingertips, murmuring, "What could possibly create this?" None of us proposed an explanation. Several steps further, Randy discovered excrement. It was substantial and irregularly shaped, unlike any animal waste we had previously encountered. We had seen evidence of raccoons, opossums, even feral cats in abandoned structures, but this matched nothing familiar. The size exceeded reasonable expectations. The composition peculiar. Randy crouched beside it, illuminating the material while wrinkling his nose in disgust. Then we detected a faint sound, a scraping as if something with claws was retreating from view. We froze, listening intently. Silence resumed. We continued more cautiously. Several hundred feet deeper, we began discovering carcasses, not rodents or small birds, but larger animals, half-consumed remains resembling canines. Astonishingly, a deer. We encountered the deer's decapitated body, exposed ribcage, flesh ragged and torn. Adrian's voice cracked as he whispered, "This defies explanation. How could a deer access this environment?" I possessed no answer, and my optimism diminished. Whatever established its territory here possessed sufficient strength to transport substantial prey underground, and was actively feeding. Adrian first sensed observation. He repeatedly pivoted, directing his flashlight into the darkness behind us. He claimed to perceive movement, a shifting silhouette, but collective inspection revealed nothing. Soon we began hearing it too, the subtle scrape of something against concrete, distant respiration that belonged to none of us. Our lights revealed only vacant corridor and moisture-laden walls, yet we felt observed, our movements tracked. We pressed forward, hoping to locate an alternative exit. The tunnel network branched unexpectedly, passages absent from public records. Some sections maintained complete silence, devoid of activity, while others contained additional nests. Debris mounds twisted into bedding-like formations. At one juncture we discovered a large alcove, carved from the wall containing bones arranged in bizarre patterns, suggesting whatever resided here possessed rudimentary organizational capacity. I noticed Randy's increasing silence. His jaw remained tense as he kept his light directed downward, searching for tracks. Then came our first definitive sighting. As we rounded a corner, Adrian's flashlight briefly illuminated a limb, pale, muscular, and jointed in a manner that induced visceral discomfort. It vanished instantly, withdrawing behind concrete supports. It possessed considerable height. That much was evident, with reach exceeding human proportion, and those eyes reflective, elevated, gleaming momentarily, before disappearing. We recognized then it represented no ordinary animal. The entity demonstrated intelligence and cunning, hurting us deeper, engaging in predatory strategy. We attempted to retrace our path, but the tunnel suddenly resembled a labyrinth. We turned left where we believed we had previously turned right, only to encounter dead ends, or collapsed segments. Repeatedly, we heard a rasping sound, a guttural clicking that reverberated behind us, bouncing from walls, and confusing our directional sense. It blocked certain routes, compelling us toward increasingly narrow, darker passages. The realization became inescapable. It was hunting us. When we finally decided to flee, we scrambled down a tunnel we believed led back to our entrance shaft. Our respiration became audible, panic evident. The creature's presence intensified, approaching. Our light's beams trembled against the walls as our hands shook. We reached a wide, partially completed station area, a spacious chamber with support columns and unfinished platforms. That's when it attacked. We never obtained a complete view, merely a massive form launching from shadows, claws scraping concrete as it lunged toward Adrian. He screamed and stumbled. Randy and I seized his arms, dragging him backward just in time. My light briefly illuminated something vaguely humanoid, yet fundamentally wrong: elongated limbs, hunched shoulders, and eyes that reflected our being. Its skin displayed mottled gray coloration, and I distinctly observed patches of hair or spines along its appendages. We ran. I cannot precisely recall our route. We followed instinct toward faint fresh air currents. The creature pursued, its footsteps echoing, consistently several paces behind, occasionally parallel, in adjacent corridors. It moved with terrifying speed and strategy, attempting to intercept us, forcing us into corners. At one junction we hurled ourselves down a narrow chute, abrading knees and elbows against concrete to evade it. By extraordinary fortune, we located the ladder. We discerned the faint outline of our entry hatch. Adrian's ankle was injured, and Randy's backpack was shredded. I ascended first, forcing the hatch open, admitting cold night air. Randy boosted Adrian after me, then scrambled up himself. As I stood on the surface, breathing painfully, I glimpsed the darkness below one final time. Momentarily, I observed a silhouette at the ladder's base, tall, gaunt, with eyes reflecting moonlight. Then we slammed the hatch shut. Randy wedged metal debris against it for security. We remained silent until halfway home. During subsequent weeks, I examined local publications. Reports increased regarding missing pets, cats and dogs vanishing inexplicably. Workers appeared near drainage systems and abandoned tunnels, sealing entrances, conducting routine maintenance, without official explanation. We maintained our silence. Who would believe our account of being hunted by an unknown entity in an abandoned subway? Adrian experienced nightmares for months. Randy refused to discuss the incident. I attempted to formulate scientific explanations: an undocumented species, a feral human, a cave-adapted predator. None satisfied completely. Whatever it was demonstrated intelligence and targeted prey, substantial enough to include humans. I continue residing in Massachusetts, though in a different community. Occasionally during late hours, passing over sidewalk grates or near antiquated storm drains, I detect that same damp organic musk. I invariably accelerate my pace, wondering if that entity still inhabits those depths, observing. The subterranean passages beneath our cities extend endlessly,
dark and forgotten. What truly dwells in those sunless regions remains unknown. You'll never find me in such places again.